And suddenly we're telling our stories to therapists, you know. I mean, I think Freud, it did a lot of harm. And because what we're doing is our storytelling then becomes a symbol of our illness and not a symbol of our strength. And we're encouraged to tell the harmful stories over and over and over again without growth. Even if you think about, like, you know, I grew up Jewish, so I don't know a lot about confession, but I'm imagining that you go in and you tell your story, and then you're absolved by doing certain reparation actions. And you don't even get that with therapy. You don't get the freedom from your story. And so in a lot of ways, it's like in the 70s with women's, you know, with that women's consciousness raising groups, and they would gather together and tell their stories. That was the kind of the first wave of taking it away from therapy, and yet they were also engaged in therapy. And so I think part of freeing ourselves to tell our stories is freeing ourselves from the belief that our lives are an indication of our illness and not of our strength. I don't know where I want to go.
Wow.
But
can I read something, a quote from Denise that relates directly to that? I think it's just brilliant, everything you said, Emma. And I have this quote from Denise about the dancing the colo. And she says, the feelings of detachment and divorce from female solidarity are erased in the shoulder-to-shoulder, circle and dance. Privatizing smothers any opportunity to bond out of strength. The movement to be in a circle or the colo is nonverbal expression of female solidarity, bonding out of strength. There's no bonding as a martyr or a victim. So like in psychology, we're supposed to come to as a victim and, you know, bond out of our victimhood. I just saw a relationship there with what you were saying. Yeah.
That's beautiful. Thank you.
Right. Yeah. I think that the stories that we foundation our lives upon, and I know that's a generalization, so I'll say, you know, in my experience, the stories that we foundation our lives upon that have been unconscious drivers for us are stories that we've picked up a lot through religion, through family tradition, the unconscious traumatic patterns that have been unknown. Those stories of that brokenness, the crippledness, which is needed to be controlled. Women have to be crippled in order to be controlled, because if women weren't controlled and crippled, they would be building, and do when they step out of that, they build cultures, villages, families of strength. They build and design cultures that will bring benefit to that life that they bring in, whether that's a child or whether it's a project. So you can't control individuals, men or women, who are strong in their clarity about that good that they are, the good that they are. So you cripple them. And that's the domination agenda beings. That's what has happened. So here we are stepping out by beginning to tell our stories of that which has crippled us, acknowledging that that's crippled us. You know, you too, me too. Oh, yeah. Okay, then that's the stories that will continue to cripple us unless we go beyond them. Then who are we really? Who were we? Well, who were my great-great-great-grandmothers before the crippling? How did they live? What were their villages like? Stories are huge because they are indications of how we create life. And so, you know, the Me Too movement it's such a good start. But we have lost touch with what that female body is all about, in my opinion. And we need to get back to that. We need to get back to that understanding. And getting the body healed in those pathways and understanding why we need to tell stories and dance together. It's information to be shared.
Yeah. I think that the fact, and my husband wrote this, Wolfgang Nebenmeyer wrote a pamphlet called The Women's Collective, and he starts it out by saying, the fact that women have been demonized, attacked, oppressed, separated, etc., all the violence perpetrated against them, is a testimony to their power.
Yes.
Because you don't do that to something that's not powerful.
Total.
Yeah. And that we must come together, women need to come together start from the base of knowing our power, not victimhood.
Right.
And just like Denisa said in that quote, and just like you've been saying, Emma, about psychology, it has us coming as victims and telling our lack of strength over and over instead of coming from the. Yeah.
I'm looking at my Jewish heritage, and you're saying, 3 generations back, and how many generations have we in the Jewish community retold the stories of victimization and oppression and clinging to it as a cultural identity of being the victim. And yes, it's historically true. And yes, it is clinging to it seems to me to have become a curse. When we sit around the Passover table and we tell the story of when we were slaves in Egypt, there's too often not an attempt to move past that and to cling to it as the identity, which is, that's just retelling the old story and embedding it generation after generation, which, and I don't say this in a blame the victim way, but it also calls to us more opportunity to be oppressed and victimized. And to step away from claiming that story as our primary identity, then when you step away from it, you become almost you're turning away from the community because you won't claim it as I don't know, whatever the opposite of a superpower is.
You're bonding through that victimhood. If you refuse to do that, then you're some kind of a traitor. Like what I'm flashing on is and for the Me Too movement, Sharon, and putting this all together, we've just been talking about, is that the next step in the Me Too movement is to speak out the fact that the reason all these women have been, sexually abused and assaulted is because of our power. Mm-hmm. So man, lay off. The jig's up. You're doing this because you're afraid of us and you're afraid of our power. Get over it, grow up, and revere woman. And then we can all work together for the good of all. You can quote me.
Yeah. I like that. A question arises, Vajra, and this is it. You must have heard some of the stories of the women from those war times in the war camps, the rape camps, and the atrocities. You must have heard some of those stories. And I don't know if you want to share one or two, but then now where do you see those women? Because they've been working, telling their stories. They've been doing, I know a lot of Danitza's work. And so where do you see them? They were extremely victimized. They were harmed. Their families were harmed. What was that, a taste of that story? And now where do you see them today as you were there in the spring, 2019?
Well, what happened, actually, it was June 2019, but what happened is they were invited to enjoy. They weren't invited to come tell their stories because they've done that already. They've already done the work. And just like Emma is saying, you don't go over and over and over and over and over. They're not identifying what's such a heavy word these days, identification, identity. They're not identifying with that. They've gone on and they continue the social engagement. They continue, don't have specifics about their lives, but they're not wallowing in a victimhood, and they're not clinging to that. And they weren't brought to the conference to share their stories. Like I said, they'd already done that work. And so they were there to enjoy and be honored and socially engage, and for us to socially engage with them. So there were no specific stories told by them. I forgot where I was going to go with that. I do want to share one more thing that happened there that they shared with us, that was part of when they were there at the conference. A woman from Ireland named Alison O'Reilly, who's written a book called My Name is Bridget, about the Tuam mother-baby homes in Ireland. Tuam is a location, Tuam. And she broke the story as a journalist, and it went very big scandal. That between 1925 and 1961, I think it was, the mother-baby homes in Tuam were, there was many mother-baby homes, but this one was run, by nuns, by Catholic nuns. And there were 796 children that they had finally discovered whose remains were dumped in the sewage tank. And this is horrific. This is like such a disrespect. And they all had names. Their deaths were recorded. And there was a lot of denial about it. It took years for it to come out, for it to be admitted. But what we had at the conference was Allison brought the quilt, this huge baby quilt, this big quilt that we all held, white and squares. There was a square for each child that had been, dumped in there. 796 children. And maybe there wasn't that many squares on the blanket, but it was 800 women participated in knitting it. That's what it was, how the correlation of the numbers came together. The big white baby blanket. And then there were some booties with strings, shoestrings coming out, long shoestrings, with the names printed of every child on those shoestrings. And so as women, we held this blanket, we spread it out and we held it. We were touched by the 800 women that had knitted the little squares that went into the blanket, And so there was a healing that happened by this social engagement, by, commemorating accountability, by commemorating the names of those children, how precious they are. And I know that when I went to touch the booties, I got a shock, like a jolt of grief or huge emotion. I had to just like back away, or I don't know what would have happened, but I felt it almost like an electric shock. So there's a tremendous healing in coming together with this simple enactment of the baby blanket and the booties, of the shoestrings and the names. So I don't know how that related to what you just said, but it's something I wanted to share that because it's powerful and it's a very simple way of coming together and healing. Yeah. And so it's commemorating the atrocity, the loss, because you had asked me, Sharon, about what were some of the stories and how do they get past that. So we didn't hear the specific stories of those particular women. Yeah. Yeah.
I think it is powerful to say they didn't come together to tell their stories. They've done that work.
Yeah.
Yeah. And now they have, by doing whatever that work was, and there's many modalities of doing the work. There's many ways of doing the work. There's no reason to carry that in generational trauma anymore. There isn't. And it has a lot to do with women reclaiming the power they have and are,
Yeah.
And now you see these women that in their families, I would assume, and I would be very surprised if it were different in their families, not just from today, but probably for several years past. I mean, it's been 20 years that she's been working with them, that their families are not acting as damaged members of a culture. They are acting as contributors and joyful and creating new, and that's really the aim, isn't it, of all of us, to move from where we are in whatever way we carry that traumatic, negative patterning, to go like, there is hope. There is hope.